All right, I want to begin this third video lecture over Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics by taking us back to a crucial idea from the last lecture and to demonstrate why the ideas we're exploring in Aristotle are significant on an existential level. Significant, in other words, in terms of how you decide to take up your existence and construct your consciousness and your life. So this idea that we were looking at last lecture on the conceptual map had to do with the human ergon. Aristotle has identified the human ergon, right, the human function, as the active life of the rational element of the soul, where active life is a translation of the Greek concept energia, right? Aristotle coins this concept, and it means being at work or actualization, in contrast to the Greek concept dunamis, which means, mere potential. Aristotle has argued that the excellent life, the eudaimonic life, is a life characterized by the activity, right, the actualization, as opposed to the mere possession of the rational element of the soul, right? So in other words, we all have the capacity to reason, the potential to reason, right? The potential to construct a life actively guided by reason, but many of us instead will lead an unreflective life where logos remains dormant, right? Potential only. And so what does this mean? Well, because human beings can reason, we have a certain rational capacity. It's the capacity to envision our lives' potential and then to formulate the necessary steps to realize that potential. We have the capacity, in other words, to generate excellent desires and goals, and the capacity to discipline our impulses and our habits in order to attain those goals. And so I want us to consider two sort of existential rhetorical questions to bring this theme home, right? Is it possible that this capacity could atrophy or deteriorate like a muscle that shrivels away to nothing because it's never actively used? I mean, if this happened, wouldn't we eventually forget that we ever possessed the capacity to begin with? I mean, Aristotle says yes. I mean, if you lack the capacity for self-reflective reasoning, how will you ever be able to reason about what it is that you're lacking? All right, existential rhetorical question number 2. If you fail to generate worthwhile desires and goals, refuse to discipline your habits, cease to develop your talents, and neglect to build out your potential, is that an ethical fault, right? A failure for which you become morally blameworthy. I mean, we'd all agree that if you treated someone else so poorly that you actually stunt their personal growth such that they don't build out their potential, well, then you would definitely be, morally at fault. But if you thoroughly mistreat your own self, mistreat your own soul simply by not taking seriously your own personal growth, then maybe you're also morally at fault. I mean, the objection to this line of reasoning says, well, okay, but it's much, much worse to harm others than it is to simply harm yourself. And true enough. But the fallacy here, right, the error in our reasoning is to assume that we aren't also harming others when we neglect our own personal development and instead let our potential just waste away, right? The truth of the matter is that you're harming the whole community because you have deprived others of your potential. You've deprived them of your many gifts, right? The community, your friends and your family, and countless others who you may impact need you to care about and prioritize the actualization of your individual potential, right? Generosity and greed actually intersect here, right? This is how the point's made in the assigned reading, How to Get What You Want. But for these same reasons, right, is why the contemplative life, the life devoted to seeking enlightenment and solitude, is not a life fit for the human being, right? We can't remove ourselves from the community. We are made to live with and for each other, Aristotle says. We are political animals, in other words. And, for Aristotle, if we don't know how to take these rhetorical and existential questions seriously, right, questions about developing or wasting our potential, it's either because we're just still too young or immature to truly embrace philosophical education, or it's because we live in a society that has failed to provide the nourishing infrastructure to promote what's best in our human nature. And instead, we live in a society that keeps logos or reason sort of dormant in the members of that society. And I think personally, Aristotle and the Greeks were onto something vastly important, which our contemporary culture has sort of forgotten. The idea that neglecting to improve oneself is just antithetical to the very telos, the purpose of human existence, right? In ancient Greek culture, they emphasized, almost obsessed over the idea of cultivating and promoting human excellence. So, the secret to begin living as the spoudios, right? The morally excellent person who takes up her existence with seriousness, who is deliberate about improving her soul. The secret is just to start today. Start small and take one small step in the direction of your self-improvement. It's just, reflect on yourself, reflect on your habits and your vices. What aspects of your life do you need to change in order to improve, right? For instance, do you exercise and do you eat healthy? Or are you lazy? Are you cowardly? Are you too socially conformist, right? Are you to some extent terrified of being yourself? And do you read enough books? Do you feel ignorant about the world around you, about history, about politics? Ask yourself, what are the qualities of your desires? Do you take time to explore your interests and develop your passions and your talents? Do your friends actually help you grow as a person? Or are you surrounded kind of by idiots, right? Or worse, cruel bullies who don't know what's important in life? Who are your role models and mentors, and are they truly worth emulating? And finally, just consider the voice in your head who observes your actions and your choices, right? This is your ruling voice, your ruling self. Does your ruling voice truly desire the good and noble things that will allow you to grow and flourish? Is your ruling voice strong enough to master your appetites and impulses? Or instead, do you maybe need to wage a coup in your heart, as it were, or launch an insurrection in your soul and establish a new ruling voice? A ruling voice that is able to direct your activities and choices toward the good. That is, toward your spiritual improvement, your personal growth, and your self-actualization. So let's take a step back and flesh out Aristotle's function argument for human happiness. Right? The function argument is Aristotle's line of reasoning which concludes that the life of self-improvement guided by reason is the human ergon. And we've noted Aristotle has a functional conception of goodness, right? In other words, a thing or a person, like a hammer, right, is good because it excels at performing its function. Goodness is a matter of functional excellence. So we say of the hammer, it's a good hammer because it's excellent at pounding nails. Similarly, right, to know what the good or excellent human being is, we have to identify our function, right? And, Aristotle asks, okay, well, does the human species have a function? And first he points out that, well, the different organs and parts that go on to make up a human body have clearly identifiable purposes and functions, The eye has a clear purpose, or a telos, and a clear function, right? The purpose of the eye is to see, right, through the ergon of refracting light. Right? What's the telos and the ergon of an ear? Right? Well, the telos is to hear through the function of turning sound vibrations into electrical signals. And the telos of a stomach is to digest food. The ergon activity, right, the function of the stomach is secreting acids, which allow it to digest food, right? The ergon is the characteristic activity that allows a thing to fulfill its telos, its purpose, right? So in all the parts of a human being, right, the kidney, the heart, the liver, pancreas, tongue, hands, feet, etc., they all have functions which enable them to fulfill their specific telos, purpose. Okay, and then Aristotle notes that the human being also has clearly identifiable functions in terms of our occupations, or the sort of work that we do. So the ergon of a carpenter is the activity of converting wood into objects, while the ergon of a tanner is making leather out of skins or hides, and the ergon of a warrior is killing his enemies. Okay, but aside from our organs and body parts, and aside from our occupations, does the human being have an ergon, right? Something unique to our species that belongs to us simply because we are members of the human species? And Aristotle says, okay, well, there are three candidates, right, for the ergon of the human species, simply considered, right, as a species. There's the nutritive function of the human being, right? That's the life of nutrition. That's the first candidate. He'll also consider the perceptual function of the human being and the rational function of the human being, right? The life of reason. The nutritive function, or the life of nutrition, have to do with those physiological activities and processes that allow a being to stay alive and grow, right? And for our species, these activities include eating and digesting food, distributing blood and oxygen throughout the body, etc., right? But again, the ergon of a thing must be species specific. It must be unique or peculiar, right, to that species. And we share the nutritive function with plants, right? So it can't count as the human ergon. For plants, the life of nutrition refers to the activities of taking nutrients from the soil, photosynthesis, etc. Okay, then, so, what do human beings engage in that plants don't? And this brings us to the perceptual function, or the life of perception, right? This is the function of our complex sense organs, which we use to perceive and navigate our environment, right? And as a result of our perceptual awareness, we become conscious, right, of our appetites and our instincts and our drives, our impulses and our urges. Now, plants may not share in the activity of perceptual awareness, but non-human animals do. So again, this activity cannot count as the human ergon, because the human ergon must be unique to the human species. So Aristotle is left with the final candidate for the human function, right? The rational function, the active life of reason. And there are two important Greek concepts here which bring us back to where we began the lecture. There is energia, right? That is active life, or being at work, actualized potential. And logos, which is reason, right? Thought, a rule-giving, creative rationality. And the rational aspect of the human soul has two aspects, Aristotle says. There's an aspect of reason that commands and an aspect of reason that obeys, right? So in your soul right now is an aspect of yourself which thinks, reasons, analyzes, and communicates. This is the commanding, rule-giving aspect of rationality. It's what we might call logos proper, right? But also within your soul right now are urges and appetites and impulses and longings, which are often characterized by intense passion. But this is the aspect of our soul which is nonetheless capable of obedience, right? This is the appetitive aspect of the soul. Now, within the soul of those individuals who are capable of self-mastery, right, those who can wield self-control, the appetitive soul accepts the rule of reason. However, within the soul of those who cannot master themselves, thoughtless appetites and impulses rule over the soul, right? There, the ruling voice of reason becomes enslaved, right, to the appetites, and logos is sort of impotent. Maybe it goes dormant or it atrophies. He who cannot obey himself will be commanded, right, as Nietzsche says. So self-mastery, ruling over our impulses and appetites, that's what allows us to take charge of our life. Now, while our appetites can listen and obey reason, the appetitive soul is not itself something which thinks or reasons, so Aristotle calls it partly irrational and partly rational. And, what else can we say about that aspect of our soul which obeys the commands given by the voice of reason? It obviously isn't the nutritive aspect of the soul, right? Because I might command my body to grow taller or to metabolize food faster, but my bones and my stomach sure as hell aren't going to obey these commands, right? The nutritive aspect of a human being is irrational in that sense, as in being without rationality at all. And the perceptual function is also irrational in that sense, right? You can order your eyes to see with 20/20 vision, but they aren't capable of obeying. Okay, so for Aristotle, for Aristotelian value theory, right, the highest value is the life guided by good reasoning. However, this does not mean that the good life is the one in which desire and passion and emotion are neglected or suppressed, right? Aristotle doesn't want us trying to live like the Vulcans from Star Trek, like Spock, right, who are supremely logical and who just don't experience any emotion at all. Rather, for Aristotle, right, the idea is that logos, right, the rule-giving aspect of reason, is creative, right? It organizes our passions and our appetites creatively, right? Prioritizing those goals and desires and habits which will nourish the construction of a beautifully lived and praiseworthy life, right? What our lives can be when we live them at our very best. But what this means is not letting our self-improvement and the pursuit of our highest goals be derailed by powerful emotions and appetites and other impulses that we can't control. So what does this look like, right? What does an active logos look like? What sort of behavior are we talking about? Well, reason, logos, is active when we take time to weed through, analyze, discover, and generate our desires, our projects, and our goals. Ways of being, ways of thinking, ways of improving our soul, right? It's when we hone our passion and discipline our appetites and cultivate our habits, right? Channeling our passion in the direction of our highest goals, right? So our appetites work for reason, not the other way around, right? It's when we, stay up late into the night excited by life and then begin scheming very specific plans to how to attain our goals, in identifying what intermediary or short-term goals we must pursue to attain our long-term vision of the good life. In other words, we have to live deliberately, as the great writer Thoreau said, right? We have to become the serious and dedicated artist who has incredibly high standards for his life and knows how to paint with both reason and desire, right? Diligently tending to the creation of his masterpiece, right? And that masterpiece is our life and how we live it, right? Living deliberately and with purpose means reconnecting what you feel and what you think with what you actually do and how you actually live. It means constantly sniffing out your potential for greatness and formulating a beautiful vision of your life and identifying the concrete steps and capabilities required to attain it. It means examining your desires and considering the origin of your desires, right? Did your existing desires and goals emerge from thoughtful introspection and deliberation? Or were they simply passively adopted from the set of desires and goals immediately on offer by your society, even if they are exceedingly mediocre desires and goals, right? So if that's what the life guided by reason looks like, what does an inactive or dormant logos look like? Well, it may look like a 25-year-old whose desires and life goals, whose knowledge of self and emotional intelligence, whose values, right, remain totally unchanged from their time in high school. It's someone who moves through life on a sort of autopilot, right, having no intellectual curiosities. It's someone who shrinks at the thought of examining and altering their worldviews and their desires. It's someone who is sort of terrified of the unknown, right? In a word, it is a thoroughly stunted consciousness, right? Intellectually and existentially, one no longer grows as a person, right? If logos is dormant and inactive like this. So the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche is again really relevant to Aristotle here, right? So Nietzsche draws, in his writings, he draws a stark contrast between two sorts of spirits, or what we might say, two distinct ruling voices that sit in command over the soul. So first Nietzsche thinks about the sort of expansive, creative soul, right? And its ruling voice wants to search into itself, to discover itself and create itself. Right? This soul knows very well that there is more to its nature than what presently shows itself. Right? Its ruling voice is constantly sniffing out its potential, which it wants to bring forth and actualize. Right? This ruling voice is even prepared to risk itself and let its present soul die off, along with its existing goals and desires. That's because the expansive soul wants to grow beyond itself, right? And its ruling voice longs for metamorphosis, for flourishing, right? For eudaimonia. Now, Nietzsche contrasts the expansive soul with the narrow soul that is small and ignorant, right? Its ruling voice is ignorant of the fact that its soul contains a multiplicity of potentials, right? 1,000 different potential desires and goals and projects that could unfold over time. But this spirit lives only on the surface of things, only on the surface of itself, right? It never looks deeper into the world in front of it or deeper within its own nature. But the narrow spirit, right, doesn't care that it's small and narrow and ignorant, because more than anything else, its ruling voice desires to preserve itself, which is safe and familiar. Why, right? Why does it prefer that? Because secretly, right, this ruling voice is terrified of risk and self-transformation. It's terrified, in other words, of eudaimonia, right? At all costs, this ruling voice says, no, I will remain the same. So ask yourself, right, which of these two souls do you currently have? Which ruling voice now sits in command over your soul? Is it the expansive ruling voice or the narrow, impoverished, scared ruling voice? All right, one kind of final point to make. And I'll be drawing on the text from Ergon to Logos, a summary of Aristotle's function argument. So let's just assume that the consumer-driven society that we all inhabit has not provided nourishing infrastructure for human flourishing, right? It's not a society conducive to the active and creative use of logos, right? But rather, it's a society whose economy functions to channel our desires towards consumption and materialism, right? Think about the fact that there is an entire industry of advertisers who constantly bombard us with the attempt to program and construct our desires for us. And because of this, logos sits dormant in the soul of many people, having shriveled away, right, out of lack of use. But nonetheless, right, we all of us have these moments of sort of intense existential drama, right? Moments of energia, moments when logos awakens from dormancy. And so think back on the more profoundly inspirational experiences you've had. Experiences where suddenly life felt like it was just brimming with exciting possibilities. Right, perhaps you felt this while stargazing, or maybe during a road trip you took across the country with friends, or watching a sunset after a day of adventure. Perhaps you felt this after you fell in love for the first time, right? When you discovered a new hobby or a new project, or when you read a book that just lit your imagination on fire. Or maybe when you experience the sort of collective power and solidarity that often occurs during a sort of protest, right, or a political demonstration. These experiences transform you, right, for a time with an outstanding excitement for life. And you begin to recognize that your life could be so much more than what it is at present. And then you feel yourself being called to live differently. And so in these moments, when you feel truly inspired, it's like a version of yourself, a version that is waiting to be actualized, calls you forth as though speaking to you from the future, and this ruling voice issues a command to your soul and says, right, develop these passions or these interests or these projects and build out your potential in this direction, right? This is logos waking up from dormancy. It's that moment of energia, right? The ushering forth of human nature. And these moments are incredibly important for us to kind of seize so that we can begin to build out our potential and establish new goals and then engage in the really hard long-term work of, cultivating our habits and bringing those habits into line with the goals that we've established and posited in the wake of such important existential, inspirational experiences, right? These are moments where human nature, human purpose is trying to be let loose and flourish, right? If we live in a society that has sentenced logos to dormancy, we live in a world that has domesticated human nature, right? And it wants to break free. This is exactly what human nature is, a purpose-driven desire to flourish, to self-actualize. All right, so we'll stop here, and the next lecture, lecture 4, will sort of conclude this analysis of Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics by addressing the important concept of virtue and its relationship to ergon, or function. Thanks.